Fear doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't consult your rational mind or ask whether the threat is real. In 13 milliseconds, faster than a single heartbeat, faster than conscious thought can form, your amygdala has already processed danger and flooded your system with chemicals that will change how you perceive the next several minutes of reality. This isn't a malfunction. This is design. For hundreds of millions of years, organisms that hesitated died before they could reproduce. The cautious inherited the earth. Your fear response is older than your capacity for language, older than tool use, older than anything you would recognize as human cognition. It operates in the dark spaces beneath awareness, making decisions about your survival while you sleep, while you daydream, while you convince yourself you're in control. A single-celled organism without a brain still recoils from harm. A jellyfish with no central nervous system still withdraws from threat. Fear is the foundation. Everything else, your memories, your personality, your sense of self, is built on top of a system designed only to keep you alive long enough to pass on genes. What follows are 100 documented truths about this system, not theories, not speculation. Observable, measurable facts about the mechanism that shapes your behavior more than you understand, and the specific ways it can turn against you. Fact 1. Genetic fear inheritance. Trauma can be inherited through your DNA without you ever experiencing the original event. Descendants of Holocaust survivors show measurably altered stress hormone profiles compared to control populations, despite being born decades after the camps closed. Their cortisol levels respond differently to threat. Their startle reflexes activate more quickly. Research on mice proves the mechanism. When male mice are conditioned to fear a specific cherry blossom sent through electric shocks, their offspring and grand offspring react fearfully to that same scent despite never being shocked themselves. The fear memory is encoded into sperm DNA through epigenetic markers, chemical tags that don't change the genetic sequence, but change how genes are expressed. Your grandmother's terror during a bombing raid can live in your nervous system as generalized anxiety. You inherit not just eye color and height, but the fears of ancestors you never met. Fact 2. The false positive bias. Your brain is calibrated to see threats that don't exist. When presented with ambiguous sensory information, human perception defaults to dangerous interpretation in approximately 70% of cases. The branch becomes a snake. The shadow becomes an intruder. The settling house becomes footsteps. This isn't paranoia, it's evolutionary mathematics. In ancestral environments, the cost of missing a real predator was death and genetic extinction. The cost of running from a harmless shadow was just wasted energy. Natural selection favored the anxious, the hypervigilant, the ones who saw danger everywhere. Every human alive today is descended from the paranoid survivors, the calm, rational individuals who carefully evaluated each situation before reacting. They were eaten. Your skewed perception is the legacy of that selection pressure, a permanent bias toward fear built into the architecture of human consciousness. Fact 3. Subliminal fear triggers. You can be terrified of something you never consciously saw. Researchers flash images of spiders, snakes, or angry faces on screens for less than 30 milliseconds, too fast for conscious perception, and measure full-scale fear responses in subjects with relevant phobias. Pupil dilation, increased heart rate, cortisol release, muscle tension, all triggered by stimuli that never reached conscious awareness. Your amygdala processes these signals through a subcortical pathway called the low road, a direct connection from your thalamus that bypasses the visual cortex entirely. The information never becomes a conscious image. It remains forever beneath the threshold of awareness. Yet it generates real fear, real physical changes, real alterations in behavior. This means you can spend an entire day anxious without knowing why, responding to threats you never actually perceived, controlled by warnings that never entered your conscious mind. Fact 4. Hippocampal damage from chronic fear. Prolonged fear physically shrinks your brain. The hippocampus, the region responsible for memory formation, spatial navigation, and contextual understanding, is exquisitely vulnerable to stress hormones. Chronic cortisol exposure is directly neurotoxic. It kills neurons in the hippocampus specifically. MRI studies of individuals with long-term PTSD or anxiety disorders show hippocampal volumes reduced by up to 8% compared to non-anxious populations. This creates a catastrophic feedback loop. The hippocampus is what allows you to distinguish past threats from present reality, to remember that the war ended, that you're no longer in danger. As it shrinks, your ability to contextualize fear deteriorates. You become less capable of recognizing that threats are over. The fear that damages your hippocampus makes it harder to recover from fear, which causes more damage, which impairs recovery further. The system can become self-perpetuating, a slowly tightening spiral with no natural exit point. Fact 5. The startle reflex speed. Your body responds to sudden threats before you exist as a conscious entity. The acoustic startle reflex reaches peak amplitude in approximately 40 milliseconds from sound to full-body reaction. This is entirely spinal and brain stem mediated. The signal travels from your ear to your cochlear nucleus to your reticular formation, and down your spinal cord to motor neurons, triggering simultaneous contraction of muscles throughout your body. Your conscious mind receives information about the startling sound roughly 80 to 100 milliseconds after the reaction begins. You jump, you gasp, your heart rate spikes, and then afterward you become aware of what startled you. For that fraction of a second, you are a purely mechanical system. No thought, no decision, no you in any meaningful sense. Just a biological machine executing a survival program written millions of years before humans existed. The reflex reminds you what you are beneath the illusion of conscious control. Fact 6. One trial fear learning. A single traumatic event can create permanent fear that lasts your entire lifetime. While most learning requires repetition, high-intensity fear conditioning can occur in one exposure. One car accident creates lifelong driving anxiety. One assault generates decades of hypervigilance. One childhood dog attack produces adult cynophobia. This is called one trial learning, and it exists because, in ancestral environments, you didn't get multiple chances to learn that something was dangerous. The lion that attacked you once was sufficient teacher. If you survived, the lesson needed to be permanent. Your brain is optimized for instant, indelible fear learning because forgetting would mean death. But this mechanism, so adaptive in the wild, becomes a liability in modern life. The traumatic event ends, but the fear persists at full intensity, treating a past danger as a present threat. You become trapped in a moment that's over, unable to update the lesson because the learning was too efficient, too permanent, too deeply burned into your neural architecture. Fact 7. Fear-induced time dilation. Terrifying moments feel longer because your brain shifts into a higher sampling rate. During high-threat situations, your amygdala triggers increased memory encoding. You're not actually perceiving time differently in the moment. You're recording far more sensory information per second than usual. When you later recall the experience, that denser memory creates the subjective sensation that time slowed down. Survivors of car crashes, falls, and violent assaults consistently report that events unfolded in slow motion, that they had time to think elaborate thoughts during split-second incidents. The actual duration never changed. What changed was how much neural recording occurred during that duration. Your brain created a more detailed file, and when you access that file, the detail translates to perceived length. Fear doesn't slow time. It creates the memory of time having been slow, which becomes indistinguishable from the experience itself. Fact 8. Developmental death anxiety. The fear of death doesn't emerge until you're old enough to understand abstract concepts. Most specific phobias develop between ages 3 and 8, but thanatophobia, death anxiety, typically doesn't manifest until early adolescence. It requires the cognitive capacity for hypothetical reasoning, for imagining future states, for conceiving of your own non-existence. Young children lack this ability. They can fear monsters, darkness, separation from parents, but they cannot truly fear death because they cannot conceptualize permanent cessation of consciousness. Then, somewhere between ages 11 and 14, the capacity develops. Abstract thinking matures, and with it comes the weight of knowing you will die. Intelligence brings awareness. Awareness brings existential dread. The two arrive together as a package inescapable. You spend childhood protected by cognitive limitation, then lose that protection the moment you become capable of real understanding. Fact 9. The FAAH gene variant. Approximately 4% of humans carry a genetic mutation that makes them biologically less capable of fear. A variation in the FAAH gene, fatty acid amide hydrolase, reduces the breakdown of anandamide, an endocannabinoid neurotransmitter that dampens fear and anxiety signaling. Individuals with this variant maintain higher baseline anandamide levels. They exhibit reduced startle responses, lower anxiety across all measures, faster recovery from trauma, and decreased pain sensitivity. They are, at a neurological level, fundamentally calmer than the rest of the population. They inhabit the same dangerous world but experience it through a less fearful lens. This variant is distributed randomly. There's no selection pressure maintaining or eliminating it. It simply exists as genetic variation, meaning some people are born with a muted fear response through no choice or effort of their own. They didn't earn their calm. They didn't develop it through meditation or therapy. They're just built differently, and they'll never fully understand what anxiety feels like to the other 96%. Fact 10. Nocturnal vulnerability programming. Your fear intensifies in darkness because you evolved as prey. Human ancestors were cathemeral, active during both day and night, but lacked the tapetum lucidum, the reflective layer behind the retina that gives true nocturnal predators superior night vision. In low light, your visual acuity drops to a fraction of daytime capacity. You become nearly blind while remaining visible to predators with better adaptations. Your nervous system knows this. Nighttime anxiety isn't irrational. It's encoded recognition that darkness represents an asymmetric threat environment where you are significantly disadvantaged. Every shadow is an information void your brain must fill with threat assessment. Every sound is amplified in importance because vision is compromised. The fear you feel lying awake at 3 in the morning is ancestral memory of vulnerability, a genetically transmitted warning that you are, in darkness, more likely to die. Fact 11. Dissociative fear fugue states. Extreme terror can sever your conscious mind from your actions entirely. During overwhelming fear, some individuals enter fugue states, periods of complex, organized behavior performed without conscious awareness or subsequent memory. People have driven cars for miles, navigated unfamiliar buildings, held conversations, and executed multi-step tasks while in dissociative states triggered by trauma or phobia exposure, with complete amnesia afterward. These aren't random movements. The behaviors are purposeful and reality-oriented, but they occur without subjective experience, without the feeling of choosing them. Your nervous system has backup programs that activate when fear exceeds your cognitive capacity to manage it. These programs bypass consciousness entirely, running automatic survival routines while your aware mind disconnects to protect itself from psychological damage. You become a passenger in your own body, watching from a distance, or not watching at all, while something deeper takes control. Fact 12. Fear conditioning in the womb. Fetuses develop conditioned fear responses before birth. Maternal stress hormones cross the placental barrier. When a pregnant woman experiences chronic fear or anxiety, elevated cortisol reaches the developing fetus, altering the calibration of their stress response system. Research shows that children whose mothers experienced severe stress during pregnancy have measurably different amygdala volumes, altered cortisol baselines, and heightened reactivity to threats throughout childhood. The conditioning begins before consciousness, before memory, before anything that could be called experience. A fetus learns the stress patterns of its environment through chemical messages, priming its nervous system for the world it will enter. If that world is dangerous, or if the mother perceives it as dangerous, the child is born pre-calibrated for threat, hypervigilant from the first breath, carrying fear that predates personal experience. Fact 13. The uncanny valley effect. Your brain contains specialized threat detection for almost human entities. The uncanny valley, the intense unease triggered by human-like but not quite human faces, exists because corpses, sick individuals, and unfamiliar hominid species represented genuine threats in evolutionary history. A face that looks mostly human but subtly wrong triggers deep revulsion and fear. This response is measurable in infants as young as 6 months, suggesting it's not learned but innate. Your ancestors who avoided corpses avoided disease. Those who feared strange hominids avoided conflict with potentially hostile groups or dangerous rival species. The ones who felt no unease approaching Neanderthals in the disputed territories may have been killed. Now you carry that detection system as an unshakable feeling that something is wrong, that the face is a threat, even when you consciously know it's just a robot, a prosthetic, a digital rendering. The ancient warning persists. Fact 14. Phobias as evolutionary preparedness. You're biologically predisposed to fear certain categories of threats. Phobias of spiders, snakes, heights, enclosed spaces, and deep water emerge far more easily than fears of cars, electrical outlets, or guns, despite the latter being statistically more dangerous. This is called prepared learning. Your nervous system evolved to rapidly acquire fear of ancient threats that were dangerous across millions of years. The brain pathways for learning these fears are pre-built, requiring minimal exposure to activate. A single startling encounter with a snake can create lifelong ophidiophobia, while people drive thousands of miles without developing car phobia despite near-miss accidents. Modern dangers haven't existed long enough for natural selection to build dedicated fear-learning circuits. You're walking through a 21st century environment with a threat detection system calibrated for the Pleistocene, still scanning for predators that no longer exist while remaining strangely calm about genuinely lethal modern risks. Fact 15. Anxiety's impact on time perception. Chronic anxiety doesn't just make moments feel longer, it alters your fundamental relationship with time. Individuals with generalized anxiety disorder consistently overestimate elapsed time by significant margins. What was 5 minutes feels like 15. An hour feels like 3. This occurs because anxiety increases attention to time itself. You check clocks more frequently. You monitor duration more carefully. Each check reinforces awareness of time's passage, creating more memory markers, which paradoxically makes the interval feel longer in retrospect. You become trapped in a subjective experience where time moves more slowly because you're afraid of it running out, or afraid of what might happen during its passage. The fear of time accelerates its subjective crawl, creating an expanded present moment filled with anticipatory dread. Your experience of reality's most fundamental dimension warps under the weight of sustained fear. Fact 16. The bystander freeze response. Witnessing violence triggers the same freeze response as being directly threatened, but with added psychological damage from helplessness. When you watch someone being harmed and cannot intervene, your nervous system activates full defensive immobility. The mammalian freeze response where heart rate drops, breathing shallows, and muscles lock. But unlike direct threat where freezing might save you, bystander freezing serves no protective function. You're paralyzed while remaining safe, immobilized by a system designed to help you survive predator attention, but activated by moral horror instead. The freeze persists even after the event ends, often developing into guilt-laden trauma. Bystanders to violence frequently experience PTSD symptoms as severe as direct victims, haunted not just by what they witnessed but by their own immobility, their inability to act. The nervous system's ancient defensive strategy becomes a source of shame in social contexts it wasn't designed to navigate. Fact 17. Cortisol's memory enhancement. Fear makes memories permanent through stress hormone manipulation of the encoding process. Cortisol and norepinephrine released during frightening experiences enhance memory consolidation, particularly in the amygdala and hippocampus. You remember threats with exceptional clarity because survival required learning from danger. The more afraid you were, the more deeply the memory embeds. This is why you can recall traumatic events from decades ago with sensory vividness. The exact lighting, the specific sounds, the particular smells, while forgetting ordinary days entirely. Your brain tags fear memories as critical information, protecting them from the normal decay that erases mundane experience. But this system creates permanent records of the worst moments of your life while allowing joy to fade. The mechanism that helped your ancestors learn from near-death experiences becomes a curse in modern life, preserving trauma in crystalline detail while happiness blurs into generic recollection. Fact 18. Social fear contagion. Fear spreads between humans through mechanisms you cannot consciously control. Emotional contagion of fear occurs through multiple channels simultaneously. You unconsciously mimic the facial expressions and body language of frightened people around you. This mimicry triggers the associated emotional state in your own system through feedback. Your brain interprets your own fear posture as evidence that you should be afraid. Additionally, you can smell fear in others. Human sweat composition changes during acute stress, and exposure to these chemical signals triggers anxiety in people who smell them, even when the odor is below conscious detection threshold. During the panic, your body odor changes, others smell it without awareness. Their fear increases. Their changed scent affects you, amplifying your fear. The feedback loop requires no communication, no conscious awareness. Groups can spiral into collective panic through purely automatic, chemical, and postural mechanisms. Fear becomes viral. Fact 19. Tonic immobility in assault. Between 20 and 48% of sexual assault victims experience involuntary paralysis during the attack. Tonic immobility is a defensive response seen across mammalian species when escape and fight are impossible. A reflexive shutdown characterized by inability to move, difficulty speaking, and profound passivity despite conscious desire to resist. It's not a choice. It's not weakness. It's a brain stem-mediated survival response that occurs without cortical input. The victim is conscious, aware, desperate to act, but unable to generate motor commands. Afterward, this paralysis becomes a source of intense shame and self-blame, feelings that compound trauma. Victims ask themselves why they didn't fight, why they didn't scream, interpreting their immobility as consent or cowardice. But the response bypassed choice entirely. It was ancient circuitry recognizing inescapable threat and activating the last resort defense of predator-prey dynamics, meant to reduce injury by feigning death. The mechanism designed for survival becomes a secondary wound. Fact 20. Childhood fear peak period. Human fear follows a developmental curve with a pronounced spike between ages 5 and 9. During this window, children experience the highest rates of specific phobias, nightmares, and generalized anxiety. This timing corresponds with increasing independence from parents, expanding environmental range, and growing awareness of danger. The child becomes mobile enough to encounter real threats, but lacks the experience to accurately assess risk. The nervous system compensates with hypervigilance. Everything seems dangerous because the assessment capacity hasn't developed to distinguish actual threats from benign novelty. Most of these childhood fears, monsters, darkness, imaginary threats, resolve by early adolescence as cognitive maturity improves threat discrimination. But some persist, and the ones that persist, the fears encoded during this sensitive developmental window, often become the most treatment-resistant phobias of adulthood. Fear learned during the peak vulnerability period roots deeply. Fact 21. The weapon's focus effect. When confronted with a weapon, your visual attention narrows so dramatically that you become nearly blind to surrounding details. Victims of armed robbery can describe the gun in extraordinary detail: the specific model, the scratches on the barrel, the texture of the grip, while being unable to identify the robber's face, clothing, or distinguishing features. This tunnel vision is automatic and involuntary. The weapon represents immediate lethal threat, so your visual cortex allocates disproportionate processing resources to tracking it. Everything else becomes peripheral blur. This creates severe problems for criminal investigations, because eyewitness testimony focuses on the least useful information while missing identifying details. The same mechanism that focuses your attention on the source of danger makes you unable to process information that would actually be valuable for catching the person who threatened you. Your survival system prioritizes tracking the threat over gathering information for justice. Fact 22. Pre-traumatic stress disorder. You can develop trauma symptoms before the traumatic event occurs. When people anticipate a specific future threat with high certainty, a scheduled surgery, an impending natural disaster, a known deployment to combat zones, they often develop intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, and avoidance behaviors identical to PTSD. The trauma is still weeks or months away, but the nervous system treats anticipated danger as present danger. Your brain has difficulty distinguishing between a threat that exists now and a threat that exists in your projected future. Both activate the same fear circuits. This means you can suffer through a traumatic event twice, once in anticipation, experiencing full stress responses to something that hasn't happened, and then again when it actually occurs. The waiting becomes its own form of trauma, sometimes worse than the actual event because it extends the suffering across time. You're being damaged by the future reaching backward into your present. Fact 23. Phobias through observational learning. You can develop intense, lasting phobias from watching other people's fear without ever encountering the feared object yourself. Children who observe parents reacting with terror to spiders, dogs, or storms often develop identical fears despite never being harmed by these things. The mirror neuron system activates when you watch someone experience fear, creating a simulation of that fear in your own nervous system. If the observed fear is intense enough and the observer is young enough, the simulation can encode as a genuine threat memory. You inherit the fears of people you watch, especially parental figures during childhood. This mechanism served an evolutionary purpose. Learning what's dangerous by watching others is safer than personal experimentation. But it also means your phobias might not be yours at all. They might be someone else's fear that you internalized so deeply it became indistinguishable from personal experience. You're afraid of things that never hurt you because you witnessed them hurting someone else, and your brain recorded that witness as equivalent to experience. Fact 24. Terror-induced analgesia. Extreme fear can eliminate your ability to feel pain entirely. During life-threatening situations, your brain releases massive quantities of endogenous opioids, endorphins, enkephalins, and dynorphins that bind to pain receptors and block pain signaling. Soldiers shot in combat often don't realize they're wounded until minutes or hours later. Assault victims discover injuries they never felt during the attack. This stress-induced analgesia is so powerful it can suppress pain from broken bones, deep lacerations, and severe burns. The system evolved because pain, while useful for avoiding damage, becomes counterproductive when you're already in inescapable danger. Pain would slow you down, distract you, compromise your ability to fight or flee. So your brain shuts it off entirely, allowing you to function through injuries that would normally be incapacitating. But when the danger passes and the analgesia fades, the pain arrives all at once, delayed but not diminished. The debt comes due. Fact 25. Mortality salience effects. Subtle reminders of death fundamentally alter your behavior and beliefs. Research on terror management theory shows that even subliminal exposure to death-related words increases prejudice, strengthens in-group preference, and heightens aggression toward those who challenge your worldview. When reminded of mortality, you unconsciously cling more tightly to cultural values and symbolic systems that promise permanence beyond your physical existence. You become more religious, more patriotic, more rigid in your beliefs. The fear of death makes you less tolerant, less open-minded, less able to accept ambiguity or difference. This operates beneath awareness. You don't feel more afraid of death. You just suddenly find yourself more certain about your beliefs, more hostile toward outsiders, more defensive of traditions. The existential terror you're not consciously experiencing expresses itself through hardened tribalism and ideological inflexibility. Your fear of non-existence shapes your politics, your prejudices, and your sense of meaning. Fact 26. Anxiety-induced olfactory changes. Chronic anxiety alters your sense of smell, biasing odor perception toward threat. Individuals with anxiety disorders consistently rate neutral odors as more unpleasant than non-anxious controls. The same scent described as neutral by calm individuals is reported as mildly disgusting by anxious ones. This occurs because anxiety shifts olfactory processing through the amygdala, which adds negative emotional valence to sensory input. Your heightened threat detection doesn't just make you see danger, it makes you smell it. Neutral environments begin to carry a subtle wrongness, an olfactory unease you can't identify but can't escape. The world literally smells more threatening when you're anxious, creating a sensory environment that reinforces fear. You're trapped in a feedback loop where fear changes your perception, and the changed perception generates more fear. The nose becomes another pathway through which anxiety sustains itself. Fact 27. Fear bradycardia. Certain types of fear slow your heart rate rather than accelerating it, while active fear, the kind that prepares you for fight or flight, increases heart rate. Passive fear associated with inescapable threat or disgust triggers paradoxical bradycardia, a rapid drop in heart rate and blood pressure. This is the fear you feel watching a surgical procedure, encountering severe injury, or facing unavoidable doom. It's the response when action is pointless. Your cardiovascular system shifts into conservation mode, reducing metabolic demand because there's nothing useful to spend energy on. In extreme cases, this vasovagal response can cause fainting. You literally drop unconscious from fear, a shutdown protocol for situations where consciousness offers no survival advantage. It's the opposite of panic, but equally automatic, a biological white flag, your body's surrender to circumstances it cannot fight or flee. Fact 28. Collective trauma emergence. Large-scale traumatic events create collective fear responses that persist for generations. Communities that experience natural disasters, terrorist attacks, or mass violence show elevated baseline anxiety levels for decades afterward. Children born years after the original event exhibit higher rates of anxiety disorders, not through genetic inheritance, but through social transmission. The community's heightened vigilance becomes normalized. Anxious behaviors are modeled and reinforced. Threat narratives are repeated. The disaster becomes woven into cultural identity. Each generation teaches the next to be afraid, not through deliberate trauma transmission, but through ambient behavioral patterns that communicate the world is dangerous more effectively than words. The collective fear becomes self-sustaining, refreshing itself through social learning long after the original threat has passed. The trauma outlives the people who experienced it directly. Fact 29. Panic attack oxygen paradox. During panic attacks, you feel like you're suffocating while actually over-oxygenating your blood. The rapid, shallow breathing of panic, hyperventilation, expels carbon dioxide faster than your body produces it. Blood CO2 levels drop, pH rises, and you enter respiratory alkalosis. This triggers the sensation of breathlessness, chest tightness, and air hunger, despite your blood being supersaturated with oxygen. The feeling that you can't breathe enough makes you breathe faster, which worsens the CO2 deficit, which intensifies the suffocation sensation. You're trapped in a paradoxical loop where breathing more makes you feel like you're getting less air. The solution, breathing slowly and deeply, feels impossible because every signal in your body screams that you're not getting enough oxygen. Your perception and physiology are completely inverted. The thing that would help feels like it will kill you. Fact 30. Childhood amnesia and fear. You cannot consciously remember most events from before age 3, but fear conditioning from that period persists. The hippocampus doesn't fully develop the capacity for explicit memory formation until around age 3 or 4, creating childhood amnesia, the inability to recall early life events. But the amygdala is functional from birth. It encodes fear associations that remain active your entire life, completely inaccessible to conscious memory. You can have profound phobias or anxiety triggers tied to events you cannot remember and will never be able to remember. The fear exists without narrative, without context, without any explanation for why it manifests. Therapy often cannot reach these pre-verbal fear memories because there's no memory to process, only emotional associations formed before language, before self-awareness, before anything that could create a recoverable narrative. You carry fears from a period of your life that is, for all practical purposes, lost to you. Fact 31. The spotlight effect under fear. When you're afraid, you massively overestimate how much others notice your anxiety. The spotlight effect, the tendency to believe you're the center of attention, intensifies under stress. You become convinced your trembling hands, flushed face, and rapid breathing are obvious to everyone around you, when studies show observers detect these signs far less than anxious individuals believe. Other people are focused on their own concerns, not monitoring you for anxiety symptoms. But your fear tells you everyone is watching, everyone is judging, everyone sees your weakness. This metacognitive distortion creates social anxiety feedback loops. You become anxious about appearing anxious, adding a second layer of fear on top of the original. The fear of being seen as afraid often becomes more powerful than the initial fear itself. You're no longer afraid of the thing. You're afraid of other people seeing you be afraid of the thing. Fact 32. Disgust as fear's cousin. Disgust and fear activate overlapping neural circuits and serve complementary survival functions. While fear makes you avoid immediate physical threats, disgust makes you avoid disease, contamination, and pathogens. Both trigger withdrawal, both increase heart rate, both create powerful avoidance motivation. The insula and amygdala show coordinated activation during both disgust and fear responses. Notably, disgust sensitivity predicts specific types of fear. People easily disgusted by bodily fluids or contamination show elevated rates of contamination-based OCD and health anxiety. The emotions cross-sensitize each other. Chronic fear can lower your disgust threshold. Prolonged exposure to disgusting stimuli can increase generalized anxiety. They're not the same system, but they're deeply intertwined, two complementary mechanisms for identifying different categories of threat. One says this will hurt you now. The other says this will make you sick later. Together they form a comprehensive avoidance network. Fact 33. Reconsolidation vulnerability. Every time you recall a fear memory, you temporarily destabilize it, opening a window for change or strengthening. Memory reconsolidation theory reveals that retrieved memories become labile, chemically unstable, for several hours after recall. During this window, the memory can be modified by new information or strengthened through rumination. This explains both therapy and trauma's persistence. Exposure therapy works partly by retrieving fear memories in safe contexts, allowing new safety information to integrate during reconsolidation. But rumination does the opposite. Recalling the trauma while experiencing fear strengthens the original fear association. Each time you remember the attack, the accident, the humiliation, while feeling anxious, you're not just remembering, you're re-encoding it as fearful, making it stronger. The memory you're trying to process by thinking about it is actually being reinforced by that processing. Your attempt to master the fear through mental review becomes the mechanism that preserves it. Fact 34. Proprioceptive fear feedback. Your brain interprets your body's physical state as evidence for what you should be feeling. This bottom-up processing means that inducing fear-associated physical states can generate fear emotions. When researchers artificially increase heart rate, breathing rate, and muscle tension in laboratory subjects through non-threatening means, those subjects report increased anxiety and heightened threat perception. The causation runs backward. Your racing heart doesn't just reflect fear, it creates fear by telling your brain, "We must be in danger, look at these vital signs." This is why physical anxiety management techniques work. Slowing your breathing, relaxing muscle tension, and lowering heart rate don't just reduce symptoms. They actively signal safety to your brain through proprioceptive feedback. Your emotional state is partially constructed from your interpretation of your physical state. The body isn't just expressing the emotion. It's generating the emotion through signals interpreted by your mind. Fact 35. Catastrophic misinterpretation. Panic disorder often stems from misinterpreting normal body sensations as signs of immediate catastrophe. A slightly elevated heart rate becomes, "I'm having a heart attack." Mild dizziness becomes, "I'm going to faint and die." The misinterpretation triggers genuine fear, which causes the symptoms to intensify, which confirms the catastrophic belief. This is called interoceptive conditioning. You become afraid of your own normal physiological fluctuations. Every minor deviation from baseline becomes evidence of impending disaster. Your threat detection system turns inward, monitoring yourself for signs of danger and finding them in the ordinary variations of human physiology. You become your own threat. The catastrophizing isn't just thinking style. It's a trained fear response where the conditioned stimulus is your own heartbeat, your own breathing pattern, your own perfectly normal bodily experience. You've been conditioned to fear yourself. Fact 36. Anxiety and probability distortion. Chronic anxiety doesn't just make unlikely events feel more threatening, it makes them feel more likely to occur. When asked to estimate probabilities, anxious individuals consistently assign higher percentages to negative outcomes. A 5% chance of plane crash becomes 20% in their estimation. A remote possibility of job loss becomes probable. This isn't just pessimism. It's genuine miscalculation of likelihood based on distorted probability assessment. Your fear warps your statistical reasoning. The more you fear an outcome, the more likely you believe it is, which makes you more afraid, which further distorts your probability estimation. You lose the ability to accurately assess risk because the assessment process itself is contaminated by fear. This creates a worldview where danger is everywhere and safety is an illusion, supported by probability estimates that feel objective, but are actually emotional calculations disguised as statistical reasoning. Fact 37. Nocebo effects of fear. Believing you'll experience negative symptoms can cause those symptoms through pure expectation. The nocebo effect, the evil twin of placebo, demonstrates that fear of side effects creates side effects. Patients warned about specific adverse reactions to inert substances report those exact reactions at significantly elevated rates. Your expectation of harm triggers the harm through psychosomatic mechanisms. This isn't all in your head in the dismissive sense. The symptoms are physiologically real. The nausea, pain, fatigue, or dizziness actually occurs, but it occurs because your nervous system, primed by fearful expectation, generates the anticipated symptom. Anxiety about health outcomes can create the health outcomes you're anxious about. The worry becomes self-fulfilling. You make yourself sick through the fear of becoming sick, trapped in a causative loop where your protective concern generates the exact danger it's trying to avoid. Fact 38. Combat stress reaction predictors. Roughly 20% of soldiers develop combat stress reactions during prolonged conflict exposure, but which 20% remains difficult to predict. Traditional personality assessments, psychological screening, and stress resilience training show weak correlation with actual combat breakdown rates. Some of the most confident, physically capable, mentally healthy recruits shatter under fire. Some of the least likely candidates endure extreme trauma without breakdown. Current research suggests that individual breaking points are partially determined by unpredictable combinations of genetic factors, prior unconscious conditioning, and random situational variables that align in ways no screening process can anticipate. This has disturbing implications. You cannot know how you will respond to extreme fear until you experience it. Your self-assessment of courage is probably inaccurate. The person you believe yourself to be under stress is speculation. The only test is the actual situation, and you don't get practice runs. Fact 39. Safety behaviors as fear maintenance. The small rituals you use to manage anxiety, checking locks multiple times, carrying safety objects, avoiding eye contact, actively prevent fear extinction. Safety behaviors reduce anxiety in the short term, which feels like they're working, but they prevent you from learning that the feared outcome wouldn't occur anyway. You check the lock 5 times and the house doesn't get robbed. Your anxious mind concludes the checking prevented the robbery, not that the robbery was never going to happen. The behavior gets reinforced. Next time, you need to check 6 times. The compulsion strengthens while your underlying fear remains unaddressed. These behaviors become prisons disguised as protection. What started as anxiety management becomes the mechanism that ensures anxiety persists indefinitely. You're maintaining your fear through the exact behaviors you believe are controlling it. Fact 40. Intergenerational silence in trauma. Families who don't discuss traumatic events often have higher rates of anxiety disorders in subsequent generations than families who openly process trauma. The silence itself becomes toxic. Children sense that something terrible happened but receive no framework for understanding it. They construct their own narratives, usually worse than reality, filling the information void with imagination. The forbidden subject grows in power through mystery. What can't be spoken about can't be processed. It becomes unspeakable, which makes it more frightening. The original trauma gets amplified through silence, transmitted not as information but as ambient dread, unnameable anxiety that permeates family dynamics without explanation. The attempt to protect children from traumatic knowledge often inflicts deeper damage than honest disclosure would have. The silence preserves fear more effectively than speaking would, creating exactly the outcome it aimed to prevent. Fact 41. Fear of fear itself. Anxiety sensitivity, fear of anxiety symptoms, is a stronger predictor of panic disorder than actual anxiety levels. Some people experience racing hearts, sweaty palms, and rapid breathing as uncomfortable but tolerable. Others experience the exact same symptoms as terrifying threats requiring immediate escape. This metafear, the fear of the fear response itself, creates self-perpetuating panic spirals. You become afraid, notice you're afraid, become afraid of being afraid, which intensifies the symptoms, which increases the metafear. The content of the original fear becomes irrelevant. You're no longer afraid of the triggering situation. You're afraid of your own reaction to any triggering situation. This transforms anxiety from a response to a condition, from something that happens in specific context to something that could happen anywhere, anytime. You become trapped in constant vigilance against your own nervous system. Fact 42. Cortisol's circadian betrayal. Your cortisol should be highest in the morning to help you wake up and lowest at night to allow sleep. Chronic anxiety inverts this pattern. Individuals with long-term stress disorders show flattened or reversed cortisol curves, low morning levels leaving them exhausted, elevated nighttime levels preventing rest. This circadian disruption creates a vicious cycle. Poor sleep increases anxiety. Increased anxiety disrupts sleep further. The stress hormone that should help you function starts doing the opposite, leaving you simultaneously wired and exhausted. You're too tired to handle stress during the day and too stressed to sleep at night. The pattern can persist for years after the initial stressor resolves, because the cortisol rhythm itself has been reprogrammed. Your daily biochemical cycle has been rewritten by fear into a pattern that sustains suffering. Fact 43. Selective attention training. Your brain can be trained to automatically prioritize threat detection, often without your awareness. People exposed to high-threat environments develop attention bias. Their eyes automatically move toward potential dangers before conscious awareness. They scan rooms for exits. They monitor peripheral movement. They orient toward unexpected sounds faster than non-anxious individuals. This bias persists long after leaving the dangerous environment. Combat veterans track threat cues in peaceful suburbs. Abuse survivors maintain hypervigilance years after escaping. The attentional system has been retrained to prioritize threat detection, and it doesn't easily untrain. You've developed an expertise in finding danger, a skill that made sense when danger was constant but becomes a burden when safety returns. Your environment changed. Your attention system didn't. Fact 44. The negativity bias asymmetry. Your brain processes negative information more thoroughly, stores it more permanently, and retrieves it more easily than positive information. This isn't equal but opposite processing. Single negative events can override multiple positive ones. One frightening experience in a location can make that place feel permanently unsafe, while dozens of safe experiences in the same location don't reverse the fear. The asymmetry is built in. Threat information gets priority processing through faster neural pathways, stronger encoding mechanisms, and more resistant memory storage. This made evolutionary sense. Missing danger once could kill you, while missing a single positive opportunity just meant trying again tomorrow. But it creates a worldview increasingly dominated by accumulated negative experiences that persist while positive ones fade. Your memory becomes a catalog of what went wrong, while what went right dissolves into vague recollection. Fact 45. Emotional reasoning dominance. When emotion and evidence conflict, your brain tends to trust the emotion. This is called emotional reasoning. I feel afraid, therefore I must be in danger, becomes more convincing than all evidence indicates I'm safe. The feeling overpowers fact. An anxious flyer knows statistically that air travel is extraordinarily safe, but remains terrified because the fear feels like truth. The emotion generates its own justification. Your amygdala's fear signal is treated as more reliable than your cortex's rational analysis. This made ancestral sense when feelings were usually triggered by real threats. But in modern contexts, where most fears are triggered by symbolic or imagined dangers, emotional reasoning produces systematic errors. You trust feelings that are lying to you because, for most of human history, feelings didn't lie. The heuristic that kept your ancestors alive misleads you constantly. Fact 46. Anticipatory anxiety duration. The anticipatory anxiety before a feared event typically lasts far longer and causes more suffering than the event itself. People spend weeks dreading a confrontation that lasts 5 minutes, months anxious about a medical procedure that takes an hour. The anticipation extends the suffering across time, while the actual feared event is bounded and finite. Often, the dreaded event proves less terrible than imagined, but this learning doesn't prevent anticipatory anxiety for the next threatening situation. Your brain continues to invest enormous resources in pre-suffering, treating future threats as present threats, experiencing them repeatedly in imagination. You live through feared events dozens of times in your mind before experiencing them once in reality. The anticipation becomes more traumatic than the event it anticipates, yet the pattern persists because it feels like preparation, like protection, like control. Fact 47. Context-dependent fear extinction. Fear can be successfully reduced in therapy settings, but remain fully active in original trauma contexts. This is context-dependent learning. You learn that elevators are safe in the exposure therapy clinic, but that safety learning doesn't transfer to real-world elevators. The fear was learned in one context and extinguished in another, creating two separate associations that don't override each other. This explains why therapy gains sometimes evaporate when you return to triggering environments. The learning was real but context-bound. Your brain has now encoded both "this is dangerous" and "this is safe" as simultaneous truths that activate in different settings. The therapeutic extinction didn't erase the fear. It created an additional, competing memory that only activates in specific contexts. When you leave that context, the original fear returns at full strength. Fact 48. Hyperventilation's hidden effects. Chronic subtle hyperventilation, breathing slightly too much, too often, creates persistent anxiety symptoms that most people don't recognize as breathing-related. You're not gasping or panting. You're just breathing a little faster, a little shallower, taking slightly larger breaths than metabolically necessary. Over hours and days, this subtle overbreathing depletes CO2, alters blood pH, and creates symptoms: dizziness, unreality feelings, chest tightness, tingling extremities. These symptoms trigger health anxiety. You seek medical evaluation for cardiac issues, neurological problems, mysterious illnesses. Tests come back normal. The symptoms persist. You become more anxious, which leads to more subtle hyperventilation, which worsens symptoms. The root cause is breathing pattern, but it's too subtle to notice and too chronic to connect to acute anxiety. You're generating your symptoms through imperceptible breath changes. Fact 49. Social rank and cortisol. Perceived social status directly influences your baseline stress hormone levels and fear reactivity. People who feel lower in social hierarchies show elevated cortisol, heightened threat sensitivity, and increased anxiety even in objectively safe situations. The perception of subordinate status activates the same neural circuits as physical danger. Your social brain treats status threats as survival threats. Humiliation, rejection, and social defeat activate fear circuits as powerfully as predators would. This is not metaphor. The activation is literal. Social pain and physical pain share neural substrates. Feeling looked down upon produces measurable stress responses identical to facing attack. Your fear of social judgment is, at a neurological level, the same as fear of harm. The modern status anxiety you experience is ancient hierarchy stress, a mammalian response to dominance challenges, playing out in contexts far removed from the survival struggles that created it. Fact 50. The resilience myth. Resilience to trauma is not primarily an individual trait, but a function of available resources and support systems. Studies of disaster survivors, combat veterans, and abuse victims consistently show that recovery correlates more strongly with access to social support, financial stability, and institutional assistance than with personality factors. The narrative that some people are just naturally resilient, serves to blame those who struggle while ignoring the structural determinants of recovery. When support is adequate, most people recover. When it's absent, most people don't. Individual variation exists, but it's dwarfed by environmental factors. The focus on personal resilience obscures the reality that recovery from fear and trauma is largely a social process requiring resources many people lack. Your ability to overcome fear depends less on your inner strength than on whether anyone helps you carry the weight. Fact 51. Conditioned immunosuppression. Fear can be conditioned to suppress immune function through learned association. In studies where immune-suppressing drugs are paired with distinctive tastes or environments, subsequent exposure to those cues alone, without the drug, produces measurable immune suppression. Your learned fear response to chemotherapy-associated environments can reduce white blood cell counts. The anxiety triggered by returning to a hospital where you experienced trauma can demonstrably weaken immune response. The association between context and threat becomes so deeply encoded that your immune system responds to the memory as if the threat were present. Your fear of a place where you were sick can make you more vulnerable to sickness. The mind's anticipation of immune challenge creates actual immune compromise, a self-fulfilling prophecy at the cellular level. Fact 52. Anxiety's perceptual narrowing. Elevated anxiety progressively narrows your perceptual field and cognitive flexibility. Under stress, you experience literal tunnel vision. Peripheral visual processing reduces as attentional resources concentrate on threat-relevant stimuli. Simultaneously, your thinking becomes more rigid. You generate fewer solution alternatives. You have difficulty shifting perspectives. Creative problem-solving capacity drops measurably. This made evolutionary sense for immediate physical threats requiring focused action. But it's counterproductive for complex modern problems requiring flexible thinking. Your anxiety about a problem actively impairs your ability to solve it by narrowing the cognitive and perceptual resources you can bring to bear. The fear makes you less capable of addressing the thing you're afraid of. You're cognitively handicapped precisely when you most need full mental capacity. Fact 53. The extinction burst phenomenon. When feared outcomes stop occurring, anxiety briefly intensifies before improving. This extinction burst, a temporary spike in fear when safety learning begins, causes many people to abandon exposure therapy just as it's starting to work. You've been avoiding elevators for years. You finally start using them. Nothing bad happens. You should feel better. Instead, your anxiety spikes worse than before. This feels like evidence that exposure is dangerous, that your avoidance was justified. But it's actually the fear's last desperate effort to maintain itself. The system that kept you safe through avoidance is fighting the new learning that avoidance was unnecessary. If you persist through the burst, fear drops dramatically. But most people interpret the spike as confirmation of danger and return to avoidance, never discovering that they were moments away from breakthrough. The fear preserves itself by surging exactly when you're closest to defeating it. Fact 54. Sensory gating deficits. Chronic anxiety impairs your brain's ability to filter irrelevant stimuli. Sensory gating, the process that prevents your consciousness from being overwhelmed by the constant barrage of sensory input, weakens under sustained stress. You become unable to tune out background noise, peripheral movement, ambient sensation. Everything registers with equal intensity. The hum of fluorescent lights becomes intolerable. Clothing textures distract. Normal environmental sounds feel jarringly loud. This sensory flooding is exhausting and anxiety-provoking, creating another feedback loop. The anxiety that damaged your gating mechanism generates sensory overwhelm that increases anxiety. You lose the ability to determine what deserves attention. Everything might be important. Everything might be threat. You're drowning in information that would normally be filtered out, cognitively exhausted by stimuli that others don't even consciously register. Fact 55. Fear avoidance and chronic pain. The fear of pain often causes more disability than the pain itself. Fear avoidance models of chronic pain demonstrate that anxiety about hurting yourself leads to protective movement restriction, which causes muscle atrophy and compensatory movement patterns, which increases actual pain, which validates the original fear. People with back pain who are terrified of re-injury avoid movement, leading to deconditioning that makes them genuinely more vulnerable to injury. The fear becomes causative. What started as protective caution becomes the mechanism creating the outcome you're trying to avoid. The pain you'd experience from careful movement is less than the pain you create through avoidance-induced deconditioning. But the fear tells you the opposite. You're crippled not by your injury, but by your fear of your injury, trapped in a protective crouch that's actually destructive. Fact 56. Nocturnal panic attacks. Panic attacks can occur during sleep, waking you from non-REM sleep with full-blown symptoms despite no conscious thought or dream content. These nocturnal panic attacks demonstrate that anxiety doesn't require conscious cognition. You weren't thinking fearful thoughts. You weren't having nightmares. You were in deep, dreamless sleep when your brain stem suddenly triggered a full panic response. The mechanism appears to involve brainstem suffocation detection systems. CO2 chemoreceptors become hypersensitive, interpreting normal sleep breathing patterns as dangerous. You wake up in terror, hyperventilating, convinced you're dying, with no conscious trigger to explain it. The experience is profoundly unsettling because it reveals that your fear system can activate completely independently of your conscious mind, that you can be attacked by your own brain while unconscious. Fact 57. Trauma bonding mechanisms. Intense fear combined with intermittent relief creates powerful emotional bonds to the source of threat. Trauma bonding, seen in abusive relationships, hostage situations, and cult dynamics, occurs when the person causing fear occasionally provides safety or kindness. The relief is so powerful in contrast to the fear that it generates intense gratitude and attachment. This intermittent reinforcement is the most powerful conditioning schedule known. Predictable threats allow consistent avoidance. But unpredictable threats that occasionally resolve into safety create desperate attachment to the threat source. You become bonded to your abuser because they sometimes stop abusing you. The person who creates the fear becomes your source of relief from that fear, and that contradiction creates pathological attachment stronger than healthy relationships based on consistent safety. Fear and relief from the same source is addictive. Fact 58. Memory reconsolidation during sleep. Fear memories are strengthened during specific sleep stages, particularly REM sleep. Your brain rehearses threatening experiences while you sleep, reactivating the neural patterns associated with trauma, which strengthens those patterns through consolidation. This is why sleep deprivation sometimes temporarily improves trauma symptoms. You're preventing the nightly rehearsal that reinforces fear memories. But chronic sleep loss creates other problems that worsen anxiety overall. You're trapped between two needs: sleep that consolidates and strengthens traumatic memories, or sleep deprivation that prevents consolidation but causes cognitive deterioration. The system that's supposed to restore you is also reinforcing your worst experiences, burning them more deeply into neural architecture with every sleep cycle. Your brain uses rest periods to practice being afraid. Fact 59. Discuss sensitivity and moral judgment. Your physical disgust threshold predicts your moral disgust responses. People who are easily disgusted by bodily fluids, contamination, and decay show stronger moral condemnation of purity violations, sexual behaviors, drug use, religious transgressions. The same neural systems process both physical and moral disgust. This means your moral outrage at abstract ethical violations is partially driven by how squeamish you are about rotting food or mucus. Your politics, your ethical frameworks, your judgments of others, all are influenced by whether you have a strong gag reflex. The fear-disgust system shapes not just what you avoid physically, but what you condemn morally. Your values feel like rational positions, but they're substantially determined by the sensitivity of neural circuits that evolved to protect you from pathogens, now repurposed to evaluate human behavior. Fact 60. Flashbulb memory inaccuracy. The vivid, detailed memories of traumatic or emotionally intense events, flashbulb memories, are no more accurate than ordinary memories despite feeling absolutely certain. You remember exactly where you were, what you were wearing, who you were with when you received shocking news. The memory feels photographic, but when researchers test flashbulb memories against objective records, they find the same error rates as normal memories. The vividness doesn't reflect accuracy. It reflects the strength of the emotional encoding. Fear and shock create the subjective experience of perfect recall while providing no actual guarantee of accuracy. You're absolutely certain about details that are demonstrably wrong, because the emotional intensity created a sense of clarity that's entirely illusory. Your most important memories, the ones you're most confident about, are no more reliable than trivial ones. You just feel more certain. Fact 61. Agoraphobia's real nature. Agoraphobia isn't fear of open spaces, but fear of being unable to escape or receive help during panic. The defining feature is anxiety about situations where fleeing would be difficult or embarrassing: crowded spaces, public transportation, bridges, standing in lines. It's not the space itself that triggers fear, but the perceived inability to escape if panic symptoms emerge. This means agoraphobia is often fear of fear itself projected onto environments. You're not afraid of the grocery store. You're afraid of having a panic attack in the grocery store where others would witness it and you couldn't quickly leave. The phobia is metacognitive, fear of experiencing fear in contexts where that experience would be trapped and observed. You become imprisoned not by the places themselves, but by your anticipation of how you'd feel in those places if anxiety struck. Fact 62. Behavioral immune overactivation. Anxiety can activate your behavioral immune system, causing you to avoid healthy social contact. The behavioral immune system, the psychology that makes you avoid sick people, uses heuristics like unusual appearance or out-group membership as proxies for disease threat. When chronically anxious, these heuristics become hypersensitive. You start treating normal people as contamination threats. Social withdrawal that feels like protection from disease is actually anxiety misallocating your disgust response. You're lonely, but your overactivated threat detection convinces you that other people are dangerous in vague, unspecified ways. The loneliness increases anxiety, which further activates the behavioral immune system, which increases isolation. You're suffering from a misfiring protection system that's defending you from connections you desperately need. Fact 63. Window of tolerance narrowing. Chronic stress shrinks the range of arousal you can handle before becoming dysregulated. Your window of tolerance, the zone between hyperarousal and hypoarousal where you function well, progressively narrows with sustained fear. Normal stimulation starts feeling overwhelming. Minor stressors trigger disproportionate reactions. You have less buffering capacity, less emotional elasticity. What wouldn't have bothered you before now destabilizes you completely. The narrowed window becomes self-reinforcing. You experience more frequent dysregulation because your tolerance range is smaller, and each dysregulation episode further narrows the window. You're increasingly fragile, with less and less margin for error. Ordinary life stress that falls within normal range for most people pushes you outside your drastically reduced tolerance zone. You're not weak. Your regulatory capacity has been systematically eroded by prolonged threat exposure. Fact 64. Attachment trauma manifestation. Early attachment disruptions create fear responses that manifest as relationship problems decades later. Infants who experience inconsistent caregiving develop insecure attachment patterns. anxious or avoidant relationship styles that persist into adulthood. These aren't just behavioral preferences. They're fear-based strategies for managing the terror of abandonment or engulfment. Anxiously attached adults experience relationships through a lens of constant threat assessment. Will they leave? Do they still love me? Their hypervigilance isn't about the current partner. It's a conditioned response from infancy when caregiver availability was unpredictable. The fear was encoded before language, before explicit memory, in a period you cannot consciously recall. But it shapes every intimate relationship you attempt, an invisible architecture of anxiety built in the first 2 years of life. Fact 65. Cortisol and cognitive decline. Prolonged elevation of stress hormones accelerates age-related cognitive decline. Chronic cortisol exposure damages the hippocampus, interfering with neurogenesis and promoting neural atrophy. People with lifelong anxiety disorders show earlier onset of memory problems and faster cognitive decline in aging. The decades you spend anxious aren't just psychologically difficult, they're physically damaging your brain in ways that compound over time. The stress hormones that helped your ancestors survive short-term threats become neurotoxic when elevated chronically. You're aging your brain faster through sustained fear, accumulating damage that manifests as diminished memory and cognitive flexibility in later life. The fear isn't just taking your present, it's stealing your future cognitive capacity, making your old age more impaired than it would have been without the chronic anxiety. Fact 66. Safety signal dependence. Objects or people that make you feel safe can become psychological dependencies that increase anxiety. Your safety person, whose presence allows you to face fears, seems helpful, but their presence prevents you from learning that you could manage without them. The dependence strengthens. You need them more and more. When they're unavailable, your fear is worse than it was before you had them. This is safety signal dependence, where the thing providing temporary relief becomes a long-term trap. You've outsourced your sense of safety to an external source, which means you never develop internal safety. The dependency relationship feels protective but actually increases vulnerability. When the safety signal is removed, they leave. You lose the object. You're more anxious than you would have been if you'd never had the false security. The crutch prevented the healing that would have eliminated the need for it. Fact 67. Neuroplastic pain generation. Chronic fear can generate real, structural pain through neuroplastic changes. Your brain's pain processing can become sensitized by anxiety, creating persistent pain without ongoing tissue damage. The fear of pain alters pain pathways, lowering pain thresholds and generating sensations that have no current physical cause. The pain is absolutely real. It's not imagined or exaggerated, but it's neurologically generated rather than peripherally caused. Your nervous system has learned pain so thoroughly that it produces pain independently of input from the body. This is why chronic pain often persists after injuries heal, the injury resolved, but the nervous system's pain-generating pattern remains active. Fear taught your brain to produce pain. Now it does so automatically, a skill so well learned it continues without the original trigger. You're experiencing real suffering from a pattern that exists only in neural organization. Fact 68. Social baseline theory. Your baseline stress levels are calibrated to your social environment. Humans are so fundamentally social that our nervous systems treat solitude as a threat state, raising baseline arousal and fear sensitivity. Close social bonds literally regulate your fear response. The presence of trusted others dampens amygdala activity and reduces cortisol. This is social baseline theory. Your normal is not being alone, and isolation triggers the same neural patterns as danger. Chronic loneliness isn't just unpleasant. It activates sustained threat responses that damage health comparably to smoking or obesity. Your fear system treats social isolation as ongoing danger because, for most of human evolutionary history, being alone meant being vulnerable to predators and environmental threats. The solitary life feels dangerous because, at a biological level, it is. Fact 69. Learned helplessness generalization. Experiencing inescapable stress in one domain can create helplessness that generalizes across your entire life. In classic learned helplessness experiments, animals receiving inescapable shocks eventually stop trying to escape even when escape becomes possible. They've learned that their actions don't matter. In humans, this generalizes devastatingly. Helplessness learned in an abusive relationship can make you passive in career challenges. Helplessness from chronic illness can make you stop trying to improve other life areas. The belief that your actions are futile spreads like a stain across contexts, shutting down motivation in domains completely unrelated to the original helplessness. You've learned at a deep level that trying doesn't help, and that learning applies everywhere. The fear of futility becomes self-fulfilling as you stop taking actions that might actually succeed because you're convinced nothing you do matters. Fact 70. Anxiety's metabolic cost. Chronic anxiety imposes substantial metabolic burden that manifests as persistent fatigue. Maintaining heightened arousal, increased muscle tension, elevated heart rate, and enhanced vigilance requires significantly more energy than baseline functioning. You're running your system at higher RPMs constantly, burning through resources faster. This is why anxiety is exhausting even when you haven't physically exerted yourself. Your body is working much harder than it appears to be. The chronic energy deficit contributes to the fatigue that makes anxiety harder to manage, creating another feedback loop. You're too tired to employ anxiety management strategies, which allows anxiety to persist, which maintains the metabolic burden, which keeps you exhausted. The fear is literally consuming your energy, a metabolic tax that leaves you depleted. Fact 71. The mere exposure fear effect. Repeated exposure to mild threats can increase rather than decrease fear through sensitization. While traditional exposure therapy assumes habituation, some individuals show the opposite pattern. Each exposure to the feared stimulus makes them more afraid, not less. This sensitization occurs when exposures are too intense, too prolonged, or conducted while experiencing high anxiety. Instead of learning safety, you learn that the thing is so threatening it remains scary even after multiple encounters. Your fear strengthens with exposure. This is why poorly designed self-exposure often backfires. You're not habituating. You're practicing being afraid, reinforcing the fear response through repetition. The exposure that should heal becomes the mechanism that strengthens what you're trying to overcome. Fact 72. Transgenerational trauma mechanisms. Parental trauma alters offspring stress biology through non-genetic pathways. Mothers experiencing trauma during pregnancy show altered placental function and stress hormone transfer. But trauma also affects parenting behaviors in subtle ways: altered eye contact patterns, different voice modulation, varied tactile engagement that shape infant stress system calibration. The child learns fear from micro-behaviors they cannot consciously detect. The trauma isn't inherited genetically or consciously taught. It's transmitted through ambient behavioral patterns during the sensitive period when stress systems are being calibrated. Your mother's unresolved trauma becomes your baseline anxiety through mechanisms neither of you understood or controlled. The fear transfers in the space between explicit communication and genetic code through the subtle behavioral language of early attachment. Fact 73. Anxiety-induced derealization. Chronic anxiety can cause persistent feelings that reality is somehow unreal or distant. Derealization, the sense that the world around you is fake, dreamlike, or filtered through glass, is a dissociative response to sustained stress. Your brain is protecting you from overwhelming fear by creating psychological distance from experience. The world feels unreal because your nervous system is defending you by making experience less immediate, less visceral. But this creates its own terror. The unreality becomes more frightening than the original anxiety. You become afraid that you're losing your mind, that reality is collapsing. The protective mechanism becomes a new threat. You're trapped in a world that feels wrong, distanced from your own life by a defensive process you cannot control, adding existential dread to your original anxiety. Fact 74. Amygdala hijacking duration. An amygdala hijack, when fear responses override rational thought, takes your prefrontal cortex offline for approximately 20 minutes after trigger exposure. During this period, you're neurologically incapable of complex reasoning, perspective-taking, or rational decision-making. The emotional brain is in control. Attempts to reason yourself out of fear during this window fail not because you're weak, but because the neural hardware for reasoning is temporarily suppressed. Blood flow has been redirected away from frontal lobes toward limbic structures. The thinking isn't available. You have to wait out the neurochemical storm, allow the 20-minute period to pass before cognitive capacity returns. But most people don't know this. They try to think their way out of panic while their thinking apparatus is biochemically disabled, then interpret the failure as evidence of their weakness rather than as predictable neurobiology. Fact 75. Vicarious traumatization. Exposure to others' trauma can create genuine PTSD symptoms in helpers and witnesses. Therapists treating trauma survivors, emergency responders, and people consuming graphic news content can develop intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, and avoidance related to traumas they didn't directly experience. The mirror neuron system and empathic engagement create neural simulations of witnessed suffering that can encode as personal trauma memories. You can be traumatized by caring about someone else's trauma. The compassion that makes you attend to suffering becomes the pathway through which that suffering enters and damages you. This is vicarious traumatization, real trauma acquired through witnessing rather than experiencing. The symptoms are identical to direct trauma. Your nervous system doesn't distinguish between suffering you experienced and suffering you witnessed with sufficient emotional engagement. Fact 76. Anxiety and respiratory control. Your breathing pattern both reflects and generates anxiety through bidirectional causation. Rapid, shallow breathing triggers anxiety by activating the sympathetic nervous system, but anxiety also causes rapid, shallow breathing. This creates a circular loop where you can't determine which came first. The pattern becomes self-sustaining regardless of the initial trigger. Breaking the loop requires conscious override of automatic breathing, slow, deep, diaphragmatic breathing. But this feels wrong when you're anxious because your body is screaming that you need more air, not less. The intervention that would help feels like suffocation. You're trapped between an automatic pattern that maintains anxiety and a voluntary intervention that triggers more fear despite being objectively helpful. Your breathing has become both symptom and cause, impossible to separate. Fact 77. The paradox of control. Efforts to control anxiety often intensify it through the mechanism they're trying to suppress. When you actively try to suppress anxious thoughts, you must monitor your mental state to detect the thoughts you're trying to suppress, which keeps those thoughts active and accessible. Don't think about the panic attack. Requires thinking about the panic attack to know whether you're succeeding at not thinking about it. This is the white bear problem. Suppression requires activation. The harder you try to control fear, the more attention you direct toward it, the more present it becomes. Acceptance-based approaches work better because they eliminate the paradox. By allowing the fear to exist without fighting it, you stop the suppression-driven activation cycle. But acceptance feels like surrender, like weakness, like you're letting the fear win. The solution feels like giving up, which is why most people continue using control strategies that make anxiety worse. Fact 78. Emotional memory priority. Emotionally charged memories receive processing priority in working memory, crowding out neutral information. When you're anxious, Your mind fills with fearful thoughts because your working memory is allocating resources to threat-relevant information at the expense of everything else. You can't concentrate on work because your cognitive workspace is occupied by anxiety content. This isn't distraction, it's priority allocation. Your brain is treating the fear as more important than the task, giving it first access to limited cognitive resources. The more you try to focus on the task, the more your attention slides back to the threat because your memory system is programmed to prioritize emotional content. You're fighting for workspace in your own mind against an allocation system that's working exactly as designed. Fact 79. Anxiety's pain amplification. Anxiety lowers your pain threshold and amplifies pain intensity. The same physical stimulus produces stronger pain sensations when you're anxious. This occurs through shared neural pathways. Anxiety and pain both activate the anterior cingulate cortex and insula. The systems interact, potentiating each other. Your anxiety makes injuries hurt more, and the increased pain makes you more anxious, creating a mutually reinforcing spiral. This is why chronic pain and anxiety disorders so frequently co-occur. They're not separate problems. They're aspects of overlapping neural processes that strengthen each other. The fear of pain increases the pain you experience, which validates the fear, which increases pain sensitivity further. You're trapped in an amplification loop where each system makes the other worse. Fact 80. Decision fatigue and anxiety. Making decisions depletes the same cognitive resources needed to manage anxiety. Decision fatigue, the deteriorating quality of decisions after making many choices, also reduces anxiety regulation capacity. Each decision you make throughout the day slightly depletes your self-regulation resources. By evening, your ability to manage anxious thoughts and resist compulsions is significantly impaired. This is why anxiety often worsens at night. It's not that more threatening things happen at night. It's that you've spent all day depleting the regulatory resources that keep anxiety manageable. The accumulated cost of daily decisions leaves you with diminished capacity to modulate fear. Your anxiety spikes when your regulatory tank is empty, creating the illusion that night is more dangerous when actually you're just more depleted. Fact 81. Anxiety and future discounting. Chronic anxiety alters how you value future rewards, creating steep temporal discounting. You prefer smaller immediate rewards over larger delayed ones because your threat-focused nervous system treats the future as uncertain. Why wait for something better tomorrow when you might not survive until tomorrow? This fear-driven present focus undermines long-term planning and goal pursuit. You make choices that provide immediate relief at the cost of future welfare because your anxiety-driven brain massively discounts future value. The preference isn't rational calculation. It's fear-based time perception where the future feels dangerously abstract and the present feels urgently real. Your anxiety about the future, ironically, makes you unable to invest in that future, sacrificing long-term well-being for immediate threat reduction. Fact 82. Illness anxiety spiral. Health anxiety creates physical symptoms that confirm anxious beliefs. Your fear of having a heart condition increases your heart rate and causes chest tightness. These symptoms feel like evidence of cardiac disease, which increases anxiety, which intensifies symptoms. This is the illness anxiety spiral. Your worry generates the somatic symptoms you're worried about. The symptoms are physiologically real, not imagined, but they're anxiety-produced rather than disease-produced. Medical tests come back normal, but the symptoms persist because the actual cause is the anxiety itself. The reassurance that you're healthy doesn't eliminate the anxiety. Instead, you begin to fear that doctors are missing something, that tests aren't sensitive enough. The negative test results become incorporated into the anxiety rather than relieving it. You're trapped in a self-perpetuating cycle where fear creates symptoms that justify fear. Fact 83. The narrative fallacy in trauma. Your mind automatically constructs explanatory narratives for traumatic events, but these narratives are often inaccurate and can increase suffering. You create stories about why the trauma happened, what it means about you, what you could have done differently. These narratives feel true and important, but they're largely confabulations, post hoc explanations that reduce cognitive dissonance but don't reflect reality. The narrative that you could have prevented the assault makes you feel more in control, but creates inappropriate guilt. The story that the trauma revealed your weakness shapes identity in damaging ways. These narratives become more real to you than the events themselves. You're traumatized not just by what happened, but by the meaning you've constructed around it. Meanings that are largely fictional but feel absolutely true. The stories you tell yourself about your fear become more damaging than the fear itself. Fact 84. Compulsive reassurance seeking. Repeatedly seeking reassurance about feared outcomes maintains and strengthens anxiety. Each time you ask, "Is this really okay?" and receive confirmation, you get temporary relief. But the relief reinforces the seeking behavior while preventing you from developing internal certainty. The reassurance works like a drug, effective in the moment, but requiring increasing doses with diminishing returns. You need more frequent reassurance about more situations. The people you ask become exhausted. The dependency grows. What started as occasional reality checking becomes a compulsive need for external validation. You've lost access to your own judgment, outsourcing all certainty to others. The seeking prevents you from learning to tolerate uncertainty, the exact capacity you need to overcome anxiety. Each reassurance makes you weaker, more dependent, less capable of self-directed certainty. Fact 85. Anxiety-induced attention blink. High anxiety causes you to miss important information during the attentional blink phenomenon. When you're shown rapid sequences of visual stimuli, detecting one target impairs your ability to detect a second target appearing within about half a second. This is the attentional blink. Anxiety substantially lengthens this blink period. Your heightened threat focus makes you less aware of non-threat information following something you've identified as relevant. This means anxiety makes you literally blind to important information that appears after something captures your attention. You miss opportunities, fail to notice critical details, and overlook alternatives because your attentional system is locked onto perceived threats. The hypervigilance that feels protective actually narrows your awareness, making you less informed and less capable of complex environmental navigation. Fact 86. The anxiety paradox of awareness. Increased awareness of anxiety symptoms can make those symptoms worse through attentional amplification. When you focus closely on your heartbeat, it feels stronger and more irregular. Attention to breathing makes it feel labored. Monitoring trembling hands makes them shake more. This creates a cruel paradox. The body awareness that mindfulness practices develop can backfire for anxious individuals, turning helpful observation into pathological self-monitoring. You become hyper-aware of normal physiological variations, interpreting them as symptoms. The attention itself amplifies what you're attending to. You're caught between the need for awareness to manage anxiety and the risk that awareness will amplify anxiety. The solution that helps most people hurts you because your attention has become weaponized against yourself. Fact 87. Anxiety and executive function. Persistent anxiety impairs the executive functions needed to manage anxiety. Planning, working memory, cognitive flexibility, and inhibitory control all decline under chronic stress. These are the exact capacities you need to implement anxiety management strategies. You know what you should do, but anxiety has degraded your ability to execute those strategies. This creates a tragic competence-performance gap. You understand coping techniques intellectually, but cannot implement them when needed because anxiety has disabled the neural systems required for implementation. You're trying to solve a problem using tools the problem itself has broken. The knowledge is there, but the execution capacity isn't. You're trapped knowing what would help but being unable to do it. Fact 88: social comparison and anxiety. Comparing yourself to others systematically increases anxiety through multiple mechanisms. Social comparison activates status threat systems, triggers feelings of inadequacy, and creates impossible standards by comparing your internal experience to others' external presentations. You compare your messy reality to their curated highlights. The comparison feels informative. You're trying to assess your standing, but it generates anxiety regardless of the outcome. If you judge yourself superior, you fear losing that status. If you judge yourself inferior, you experience status threat. The comparison itself is the problem, not the result. But anxiety drives more comparison as you try to locate yourself in social hierarchies and assess threats. Each comparison increases anxiety, which drives more comparison, which increases anxiety. You're trapped in a loop where the assessment tool generates the suffering you're trying to assess. Fact 89: anxiety's temporal binding. Anxiety compresses your sense of time, making the past feel closer and the future feel nearer. Traumatic memories feel like they happened yesterday regardless of actual elapsed time. Future threats feel imminent even when objectively distant. This temporal compression occurs because anxiety increases the emotional weight of past and future events, and emotional weight distorts temporal perception. Events that matter feel closer in time. Your brain represents temporal distance partly through emotional intensity. The more emotionally significant something is, the closer it feels. Chronic anxiety keeps past traumas and future threats emotionally active, which makes them feel temporally close. You're simultaneously haunted by a past that won't recede and threatened by a future that feels immediately present. The normal cushioning of time collapses under anxiety's weight. Fact 90: performance anxiety feedback. Anxiety about performing well creates the poor performance you're afraid of through choking under pressure. Pressure increases self-consciousness, which shifts motor control from automatic to explicit processing. Skills that usually operate unconsciously, speaking, athletic performance, musical execution, become deliberate and clumsy when you're anxiously monitoring them. The monitoring itself disrupts performance. You're overriding smooth automatic processes with effortful conscious control, like trying to walk by consciously controlling each muscle. The fear of failure activates the mechanism that creates failure. This is why "don't think about it" helps performance. It allows automatic processes to operate without conscious interference. But anxiety makes not thinking about it impossible. You're trapped between automatic performance that would work and conscious monitoring that disrupts it, unable to access the automatic mode because fear keeps triggering the conscious override. Fact 91: the nocebo effect in anxiety disorders. People with anxiety disorders show dramatically stronger nocebo responses, negative outcomes from believing something will harm you. When told an inert substance might cause anxiety, anxious individuals develop symptoms at rates far exceeding non-anxious controls. Your expectation of harm creates harm with remarkable efficiency. This isn't weakness or gullibility. It's a learned association between predictions and outcomes that's been strengthened through repeated confirmation bias. Anxious predictions usually feel like they come true because you're hyperattentive to confirming evidence and dismiss disconfirming evidence. This trains your nervous system that anxious expectations are reliable predictors, which makes future expectations more powerful. Your nocebo sensitivity is a trained skill, unfortunately directed at creating the outcomes you fear. The expectation becomes causative through mechanisms you cannot consciously control. Fact 92: anxiety-induced prosopagnosia. Severe anxiety can impair face recognition, creating temporary prosopagnosia, face blindness. High stress disrupts the fusiform face area and other regions involved in facial processing. You fail to recognize familiar people or struggle to distinguish faces. This social recognition failure increases anxiety about social situations, which maintains the processing disruption. You avoid social context because you can't reliably recognize people, which prevents the exposure that might reduce anxiety, which maintains the recognition deficit. The impairment is real. You genuinely cannot process faces normally when anxious, but it's functional, not structural. The hardware is fine. The anxiety has temporarily disabled the face processing software. When anxiety reduces, recognition returns. But during anxious periods, you're navigating social worlds unable to access one of humanity's most fundamental social capacities. Fact 93. Fear generalization gradients. Fear learned in response to one specific stimulus automatically generalizes to similar stimuli. This generalization follows a gradient. The more similar something is to the original threat, the stronger the fear response. This is adaptive for genuine threats. If one snake is dangerous, similar snakes probably are too. But in anxiety disorders, the generalization becomes pathological. Fear of one dog becomes fear of all dogs, then fear of pictures of dogs, then fear of dog-related words. The gradient extends far beyond reasonable similarity. You develop fear responses to things that share only abstract or symbolic connections to the original threat. The generalization that should create useful behavioral flexibility instead creates ever-expanding fear territories. Each generalization step seems logical in isolation, but the cumulative effect is phobic responses to vast categories of stimuli that bear minimal actual relationship to the original danger. Fact 94. The spotlight effect asymmetry. When anxious, you overestimate how much others notice your anxiety but underestimate how much others share it. You believe your trembling, sweating, and nervousness are obvious to everyone while assuming others appear calm. In reality, others are so focused on managing their own anxiety that they barely notice yours. The asymmetry creates isolation. You feel uniquely damaged, alone in your struggle, surrounded by people who seem fine. This perception barrier prevents recognition of shared experience. If you knew how many people around you were equally anxious, the anxiety would feel less abnormal, less shameful. But the spotlight effect makes you believe you're uniquely visible in your distress, while others remain opaque. The illusion of being alone in your fear is often more isolating than the fear itself. Fact 95. Anxiety and immune senescence. Chronic anxiety accelerates immune system aging through a process called immunosenescence. Sustained cortisol elevation suppresses immune function, reduces new immune cell production, and causes premature aging of existing immune cells. Your immune system doesn't just weaken, it ages faster. The biological markers of immune aging, shortened telomeres, reduced naive T cells, increased inflammatory markers, progress faster in chronically anxious individuals. You're developing an elderly immune system while chronologically young. This manifests as increased infection susceptibility, slower wound healing, reduced vaccine response, and higher cancer risk. The fear that kept your ancestors alive becomes, under chronic modern conditions, a mechanism that ages your immune defenses, making you more vulnerable to the diseases you might be anxiously monitoring for. The protection becomes self-harm operating on a timescale of years. Fact 96. Exposure therapy dropouts. Between 30 and 50% of people starting exposure therapy for phobias drop out before completion. The treatment most likely to eliminate their fear is too frightening to complete. This isn't weakness. Exposure therapy requires repeatedly confronting the thing that terrifies you, enduring acute distress for prolonged periods, trusting that fear will eventually decrease. That's asking someone to deliberately induce the state they've spent years avoiding. The dropout rate reveals how powerful avoidance motivation is. Even when you desperately want to change, even when you understand the treatment rationale, even when you've already invested time and money, The fear of facing your fear remains stronger than the desire for freedom from fear. The cure requires becoming willing to suffer in ways the disorder exists to prevent. Many people cannot cross that threshold, leaving them locked into phobias they want to overcome but cannot face overcoming. Fact 97. The anxiety screening effect. Anxiety causes you to preemptively avoid situations you would likely handle successfully, creating a biased sample of experiences. You only attempt things you're fairly confident about, screening out challenges that provoke anxiety. This creates a distorted feedback loop. You rarely fail because you only try easy things, but you interpret your limited successes as evidence you can't handle harder challenges. Your anxious predictions about how you'd perform are never tested. The prediction, "I would fail," remains unfalsifiable because you never attempt the things you predict you'd fail at. Your beliefs about your limitations are based on screening out the evidence that would contradict those beliefs. You're trapped in a self-confirming worldview where anxiety prevents exactly the experiences that would prove anxiety wrong. Fact 98. Nocturnal anxiety amplification. Anxiety consistently worsens at night through multiple converging mechanisms. Cortisol naturally drops in the evening, reducing your physiological capacity to manage stress. Reduced sensory input means fewer distractions from anxious thoughts. The darkness triggers ancestral vulnerability responses. Decision fatigue from the day has depleted self-regulation resources. The approaching sleep feels like loss of control. These factors compound. The same worries that felt manageable at noon become catastrophic at midnight, not because the situation changed, but because your regulatory capacity has been systematically eroded throughout the day. The nighttime anxiety spike is so predictable and so physiologically determined that reassuring yourself it's just your depleted nervous system doesn't help. You know intellectually why you're more anxious, but that knowledge doesn't reduce the anxiety because the mechanisms operate beneath the level of conscious override. Fact 99. The anxiety identity trap. Long-term anxiety disorders can become integrated into identity, making recovery feel like self-annihilation. When you've been anxious for years or decades, anxiety becomes part of how you understand yourself. It shapes your choices, relationships, and self-concept. Recovery means becoming someone different. This creates resistance to change that operates beneath conscious awareness. Part of you wants to overcome anxiety. Another part resists because recovery feels like death of the self you know. Who would you be without this fear that has defined you? The uncertainty of a non-anxious identity becomes its own source of anxiety. You're afraid of not being afraid because the person who isn't afraid is a stranger. The disorder has become so embedded in your sense of self that removing it feels like removing yourself. You're trapped between the suffering of the anxiety and the identity threat of recovery. Fact 100. Anxiety's wisdom distortion. Anxiety feels wise, like it's protecting you by identifying threats others miss. This perception creates profound resistance to change because letting go of anxiety feels like willfully blinding yourself to danger. The hypervigilance, the constant scanning, the catastrophic predictions all feel like superior threat detection rather than distorted perception. You believe you see the world more clearly than calm people who are dangerously naive about how much could go wrong. This protective interpretation of anxiety makes it nearly impossible to relinquish. Accepting that your anxiety distorts rather than clarifies reality requires admitting you've been seeing the world wrong, that the vigilance you believed kept you safe was actually harming you. The recognition that your fear has been lying to you, that the wisdom was false wisdom, that the protection was phantom protection. This may be the most difficult realization of all. Your anxiety has convinced you it's insight. Recognizing it as distortion feels like choosing delusion, but that recognition is where freedom begins. The mechanisms persist whether you understand them or not. Your amygdala will continue making decisions in milliseconds. Your cortisol will rise and fall in patterns shaped by every threat you've encountered. The fear memories will remain, encoded in neural architecture that outlasts conscious memory, influencing behaviors you believe are choices. You are the product of survival systems refined across hundreds of millions of years, and those systems are not designed for your happiness. They are designed for your genetic perpetuation. In a world where immediate physical threats are rare, these mechanisms often misfire, seeing danger in social rejection, in uncertainty, in the mere possibility of future pain.